This is what it looks like when a nation is toppled. Protests flooding the streets, a presidential palace under siege, a democratically elected leader is dead, and a military junta has taken his place. For years, the Central Intelligence Agency has been writing, refining, and executing a playbook for regime change. It's a playbook that's been used to dismantle foreign governments from the inside out, often leaving a trail of dictatorships, civil wars, and failed states. From the jungles of Central America to the presidential palaces of South America and the war-torn streets of the Middle East, the methods are impressively consistent. It's less of a single book and more of a demolition expert's toolkit with different tools for different jobs: propaganda, economic warfare, and armed insurgency. And it all begins not with a bang, but with a whisper. In this video, we're exposing that playbook, play by shocking play. Welcome to Empire Secrets. The first, and maybe the most crucial play in the CIA's book, is the war for the mind. Before you can topple a government, you have to convince its people, and the world, that it deserves to fall. You have to create an atmosphere of fear, instability, and crisis. There's no better example of this than the 1954 coup in Guatemala. In the early 1950s, Guatemala was a budding democracy. Its president, Jacobo Arbenz, was a popular leader who initiated sweeping land reforms for landless peasants. But his policies put him on a collision course with a very powerful American corporation, the United Fruit Company, which owned vast tracts of land and had immense political power in both Guatemala and Washington, D.C. United Fruit, with its close ties to the Eisenhower administration, lobbied hard for U.S. intervention, painting Arbenz's reforms as a slide toward communism. President Eisenhower, already inclined to see communist threats in America's backyard, authorized the CIA to execute Operation PB Success in August 1953. With a budget of millions, its main weapon wasn't an army, but an idea. The plan was officially a clandestine operation of psychological warfare and political action. The goal? To convince the Guatemalan people, and more importantly, the Guatemalan military, that a massive popular uprising was already underway, and Arbenz was doomed. The architect of this psychological war was David Atlee Phillips, a CIA public relations expert. His strategy, codenamed Operation Sherwood, was a masterclass in deception. The strategy was to create a phantom menace. Think of it like this: the CIA wasn't building a real army, they were directing a horror movie, and the soundtrack was piped directly into the nation's ears. They set up a secret radio station in neighboring Honduras called The Voice of Liberation, broadcasting into Guatemala. It carried a constant stream of anti-government propaganda. It reported fake news of battles, rebellions, and defections that simply weren't happening. It created the illusion of a powerful rebel army, led by an exiled Guatemalan officer named Carlos Castillo Armas, sweeping through the country. In reality, Armas's army was a meager force of a few hundred men, armed and trained by the CIA. They were hardly capable of defeating Guatemalan's 5,000-strong professional army. But they didn't have to. The radio did the fighting for them. The Voice of Liberation reportedly broadcast sound effects of roaring crowds and battlefield noises to create the auditory illusion of a nationwide revolt. They dropped leaflets from unmarked planes, some carrying death notices to government supporters, all designed to create paranoia. The psychological pressure was relentless. When Armas's small force finally crossed the border on June 18, 1954, their military campaign was largely a failure. But CIA-backed planes, flown by American pilots, bombed key targets in Guatemala City. This wasn't about causing massive destruction, it was about amplifying the propaganda. The bombings seemed to confirm the radio's narrative of a full-scale invasion. The Guatemalan military, bombarded with fake reports and seeing planes attack their capital, lost its nerve. They refused to fight. On June 27th, just 9 days after the so-called invasion began, Jacobo Arbenz resigned. He wasn't defeated by an army, but by a ghost army, a phantom created by radio waves and fear. The CIA had toppled a democratically elected government, installing the first in a long line of US-backed military dictators in Guatemala. Operation PB's success was hailed within the agency as a model for future interventions. It answered the first question: could a government be removed without firing a shot? The answer was yes. But the next question was more dangerous. What if the population refuses to turn against its own government anyway? That's when the pressure stops being psychological and starts becoming physical. Not through violence at first, but through empty shelves, frozen credit, and a life that slowly stops working. If psychological warfare is the art of making a country think it's collapsing, the next play is about making it feel that collapse through its economy. The strategy is to create so much financial pain that the population turns on its own government, creating a coup climate ripe for a military takeover. This was the exact strategy unleashed against Chile in the early 70s. In 1970, Chileans democratically elected Salvador Allende, a socialist, as their president. His platform included nationalizing key industries, most notably the massive copper mines, which were largely owned by American corporations. In Washington, President Richard Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger saw Allende as another Cuba and were determined to get rid of him. Days after Allende's election, Nixon met with CIA Director Richard Helms. Helms' handwritten notes from that meeting are chillingly direct. The president's orders were to make the economy scream. $10 million were made available for the CIA to undermine Allende's government. This was the start of a 3-year campaign of economic warfare. The plan had 2 tracks. Track 1 was a political effort to bribe the Chilean Congress to block Allende's confirmation. When that failed, the administration fully committed to Track 2, a military coup preceded by intense economic and social destabilization. The US government used its immense global power to choke the Chilean economy. It was like a python wrapping itself around the country's economic windpipe. It imposed an invisible blockade, pressuring institutions like the World Bank to cut off loans to Chile. This starved the country of the foreign currency it needed to import essential goods. The result was devastating. Shortages of food, medicine, and basic supplies became a plague. Long lines outside empty shops became a daily reality for ordinary Chileans. At the same time, the CIA funneled millions into Chile to fuel internal opposition. This wasn't just letting the country get sick, it was like injecting a virus into its circulatory system. They secretly funded opposition parties, anti-Allende media like the newspaper El Mercurio, and business associations. A huge portion of this funding went to inciting labor unrest. The CIA helped finance crippling strikes, most famously the truck owners' strike, which paralyzed the country's transportation network. This manufactured chaos stopped food from reaching the cities, making the shortages even worse and creating a sense of total crisis. The goal was to make life under Allende unbearable. The CIA's propaganda machine, having learned from Guatemala, worked hand in hand with the economic pressure. Agency-funded media blamed the chaos on the government's socialist policies, conveniently ignoring the US blockade and the covertly funded strikes. They painted a picture of a country spiraling into ruin, a narrative designed to justify a military takeover. By 1973, the Chilean economy was indeed screaming. Hyperinflation was out of control, and society was at breaking point. The middle and upper classes, squeezed by the economic turmoil and terrified by the propaganda, began to openly call for the military to step in. The CIA and the Nixon administration had successfully created the coup climate they wanted. And they had set the stage for what was about to happen next, the final, most brutal play in their regime change strategy. Once a country is weakened by propaganda and its economy is on its knees, the final act can begin, the military coup. This is where whispers turn into gunshots. The CIA's role here is like a crooked boxing promoter. They don't step into the ring. Instead, they identify a willing fighter, give them the tools, and flash the green light. The US government's policy was clear. A declassified CIA cable from October 1970 stated, It is firm and continuing policy that Allende will be overthrown by a coup. To make this happen, the CIA started cultivating contacts in the Chilean armed forces, identifying officers hostile to Allende's government. The biggest obstacle was the army's commander-in-chief, General René Schneider, a staunch constitutionalist who acted as the military's honest referee, believing its job was to uphold democracy, not destroy it. He had to be removed. The CIA made contact with groups of plotters led by retired General Roberto Vio and active General Camilo Valenzuela. The agency provided untraceable machine guns and money for a plot to kidnap Schneider. The intention was to abduct him, blame it on Allende's supporters, and trigger a military takeover. On October 22nd that same year, the plot went wrong. Schneider resisted, was shot, and died 3 days later. While the CIA later claimed his death wasn't intended, their support for the plotters who killed him was undeniable. With Schneider gone, the path was cleared for a less principled military leadership. Over the next 3 years, as the economic and psychological warfare intensified, the CIA kept its lines open to disgruntled military officers. They gathered intelligence, offered encouragement, and signaled that the US would support a new regime. Declassified documents show that US officials were well aware of the coup plotting. A CIA cable from September 10, 1973, confirmed the military was planning to move against Allende the very next day. On the morning of September 11th, the military, led by General Augusto Pinochet, made its move. The army surrounded La Moneda, the presidential palace. The Air Force bombed the palace, the home of the democratically elected president. Salvador Allende, refusing to surrender, died inside as it was stormed. Immediately after the coup, the United States recognized Pinochet's new military junta, and the economic aid that was cut off under Allende started flowing back into the country. While the US long maintained it didn't directly participate in the coup, a 2000 CIA report admitted the agency actively supported the military junta after the overthrow of Allende, and that its hostility was well known to the Chilean plotters. As scholar Peter Kornbleu argues, the 3-year covert operation was crucial in laying the groundwork for the beginning of Pinochet's era. The aftermath was a 17-year military dictatorship marked by horrific human rights abuses. Thousands of political opponents were arrested, tortured, and murdered. The coup in Chile became the archetypal example of the CIA's playbook in action, a multi-year operation that combined psychological, economic, and military pressure to overthrow a democracy and replace it with a brutal, pro-American dictatorship. However, by the time Chile ended, the method had reached its limit. Removing governments directly left fingerprints, accountability, and consequences that were no longer easy to deny. And once exposure becomes inconvenient, as we will see next, the intelligence agency looked for ways to operate at a distance. In the post-Cold War era, the playbook evolved. Backing military coups that installed dictators became diplomatically messy. So, a new, more deniable chapter was refined, arming and training local insurgents to fight a proxy war. It's like handing a can of gasoline and a book of matches to angry factions in a volatile neighborhood, hoping the fire only burns down one specific house. The Syrian civil war and the CIA program known as Operation Timber Sycamore is a modern, tragic case study. Launched around 2012 or 2013 under the Obama administration, Timber Sycamore was a covert CIA operation with a clear objective: to help overthrow Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The program, run with intelligence services from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, involved supplying weapons and training to various Syrian opposition groups. With a budget estimated at around $1 billion a year, it was one of the agency's most expensive covert operations. Unlike the swift coups in Guatemala and Chile, this was about fueling a long, grinding conflict. Based out of Jordan, the CIA trained thousands of rebels to use sophisticated weaponry, including assault rifles, mortars, and anti-tank missiles. Saudi Arabia primarily provided the money and weapons, while the US led the training. The program was designed to be deniable. Weapons were often sourced from Eastern Europe to hide their American origin. The logic was to apply enough military pressure on Assad's forces to either force him from power or bring him to the negotiating table on Washington's terms. The CIA-backed fighters were effective for a time, reportedly causing tens of thousands of casualties among Syrian soldiers and their allies. But this play came with massive, catastrophic risks. The Syrian battlefield was a chaotic mess of armed groups with shifting alliances and extremist ideologies. A core problem of Timber Sycamore was that fires have a mind of their own. A significant amount of weaponry supplied by the program reportedly ended up on the Middle East's black market. Worse, many of these advanced weapons ended up in the hands of extremist groups, including Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria and even ISIS. In effect, a CIA program designed to topple one US enemy inadvertently ended up arming others. This consequence was so stark that the program was criticized by many as expensive, ineffective, and dangerously counterproductive, fueling a conflict that has claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. In 2017, the Trump administration officially ended the Timber Sycamore program, acknowledging its failures. But the damage was done. The proxy war didn't lead to a stable, democratic Syria. Instead, it had contributed to the country's destruction, strengthened jihadist groups, and created a humanitarian disaster of epic proportions. The playbook had been updated for the 21st century, but the consequences remained a consistent, tragic outcome. These events aren't isolated incidents. They're chapters from the same manual, a collection of tactics for dismantling nations that has been used time and again. From propaganda that works like a ghost story, to frighten a nation into submission, to economic blockades that starve it into desperation, to backing a coup like a crooked promoter fixing a match. The methods are clear, and the results are devastating. The long-term consequences of these operations are a legacy of violence, instability, and deep-seated mistrust. For every successful regime change, there's a trail of broken democracies, brutal dictatorships, and spiraling civil wars. The playbook is designed for short-term wins, but it consistently delivers long-term tragedy. It reveals a chilling truth, that sometimes the very institutions created to protect a nation's interests become the architects of another's destruction. Sometimes I think about why this pattern still matters to people who weren't alive when any of this happened. People who don't live in Guatemala or Chile or Syria. People who've never seen a coup and probably never will. The names change, the language gets softer, the methods look more technical, but the logic stays familiar. You'll see moments when a country feels unstable without being at war, when confidence disappears faster than facts, when daily life gets harder in ways that never trace back to a single decision. What's unsettling isn't that powerful institutions interfere, it's how normal the pattern has become, how easily disruption gets mistaken for failure, how quickly responsibility gets blurred, how often the ending arrives before anyone agrees on what actually happened. Because once you've seen this sequence enough times, you start noticing that modern crises follow the same rhythm, even when no one calls it a coup, even when everything still looks legal on paper. The past isn't repeating itself exactly, it's refining itself. And maybe that's the real legacy here, not just the governments that were removed, but the template that was left behind, one that still shapes how pressure gets applied today and how outcomes get explained afterwards. That's why these stories don't feel like history. They feel unfinished. I don't make these videos to tell people what to think. I make them for people who notice when explanations feel incomplete, when outcomes arrive before causes are agreed on, when power moves quietly and everyone pretends it didn't. If you're one of those people, you already know why you're here. This was Empire Secrets. Your desire, your empire.